We're now at the final keynote presentation. We have spent the last day and a half looking at the history of ISR and also at many of the projects that are currently ongoing. And we're going to conclude the symposium with a look at the future of data collection. And our presenter for this session, the keynote speaker, is Frauke Kreuter. Frauke received her degrees in empirical social science research and survey research methodology from the University of Mannheim and the University of Constance. She has an appointment as professor of survey methodology at the University of Maryland and as chair of statistics and data science from the social sciences and humanities in the Department of Statistics at Ludwig Maximilian's University in Munich, Germany. Frauke is also an adjunct research scientist in the Survey Research Center at ISR. Frauke is the current president of the American Association for Public Opinion Research. Her research interests include privacy, uncovering biases in data and measurements, unlocking administrative data for research, and creating an information infrastructure for society. And as I indicated today, her talk will focus on the future of data collection. Please join me in welcoming Frauke.
Thanks, Mike. We switched the microphone here. Can you guys hear me okay in the back? Okay, cool. Thank you very much for letting me speak here at this closing. And as I walked to the building earlier, I sort of remembered in 1997, I think, I was here for the first time for a summer school. And it's kind of cool to now be on this stadium, on this podium. So the task that Mike gave me is a difficult one because predicting the future, while we're in the business of predicting, we know that the best predictions sort of work if you predict a day out or a click out, right, from an advertisement to see to then actual prediction. We heard earlier this morning that in particular in this life course development part, predicting the future is quite difficult because stuff happens. And so, try to use a little crystal ball here. And I want to make 3 predictions about the future. And one have to do with networks, one with people, and one with stuff, colorful stuff. The predictions do look a little bit back into the past because some of what happens in the past still is relevant for the future. It's not always new. And the first piece on is related to a moment roughly 10 years ago when I felt like I was giving these kind of talks also already because we had this big scare of surveys going away, this big push to using big data. We had the formation of the evidence-based policymaking commission. Bob Groves, who spoke to us yesterday, was leading this first of 2 panels in this space on how to use multiple data sources for mostly government statistics, but really, informing all of us. And we had the April report on big data. And back then, it was also the big question. So what are we doing with this changing environment? What's the future of data collection going to look like? And a lot of interesting things have happened since that are mirrored also as what had happened at ISR. One was this big push for myself, as it related to the Coleridge Initiative, but this big push to create safe cloud-based research spaces in which a lot of different data sources can be housed. And certainly ICPSR has done similar things very successfully, and I'll say something to that in a moment. But also this big push to expand the set of knowledge and skills used and taught. And certainly the programs housed in this building have done that too. Out of this and reaching into the future are interesting new partnerships, both with government agencies. We heard yesterday about the new partnership with the Census Bureau, but also for some of you that might not be aware with, I think it's pretty fantastic that ICPSR has this partnership with Meta on the social media monitoring, a very new way of accessing data, not on-premise here or partially on-premise here, but sort of in a close conjunction with the data holder. And the data holder being a social media platform, that was the big push, right? 10 years ago that we thought, oh, we can just read out society by looking at social media data and any possible other data stream that we can find, whether this is administrative records, whether this is social media data, the Fitbits of this world. Until then, in recent years, we realized those data also have missing data problems and all of their problems. And the development that I see, though, reaching into the future from that space is related to this relationship to the data holders themselves, whether it's census or Meta or individual people, is this big push towards, getting at a data donation mindset, whether it's from institution or individual people. I see, in particular on the EU side, a big push in that direction. And this is partially driven by EU regulation because it is much harder to just grab the data from those that house them. But every individual now, because of the change in regulation for GDPR, is able to download their own data and is able to share those data out with researchers. And so to me, from this first strand, this is a development that I think is quite interesting for us on the research side because it allows new streams of data to be augmented in this conjunction, in this network of data that Bob Groves was talking about yesterday morning, right? So the past, paving the way for this kind of data collection in the future. Now, even so, 10 years ago, we might have thought the future really relies heavily on these other data sources, and in particular, the administrative data sources. We all know that 5 years ago, all of a sudden, the winds changed, right? All of a sudden, it was back to data from people, back to surveys, back to getting information quickly. And that was because of the onset of the COVID pandemic, changing everything that we knew about data streams and where we could grab the data and what it means. And, for me, but also, people here, this is just one attempt that I'm showing, it was interesting to see that, the WHO and many other public health researchers, while they knew and had access to hospital data and whatnot, they approached, various researchers and organizations and companies, in this case, Meta and us in Maryland, in Carnegie Mellon University, to launch surveys, in this case, worldwide surveys, right? And to all of you that participated in that surveys, thank you very much. This was a random sample of active Facebook users that were asked whether they have some symptoms or not to create an early monitoring system for symptoms. And Meta had to work with the two universities in order to be able to share out the data the next day to public health decision makers, right? So it's a very fast pipeline that happened there. They would draw random samples. The invitation would only go out to random samples of their usership. Granted, the usership is biased, not everyone is on Facebook, but the COVID pandemic development likely unrelated to your participation on the Facebook platform, and therefore a good signal, which later on we were able to demonstrate in looking at the correlation between hospital records and COVID symptoms as the survey picked it up in every country over time, right? This is this graph, probably not legible. Doesn't matter, just a colorful graph making the point. You can read this paper in PNAS, but the point I want to make is that it is so interesting to me to see how these new forms of partnership, these new forms of data collection, and a renewed focus on what is the task we're trying to accomplish shapes a way of data collection that I think is forward-looking, because we all know it's too much of a straitjacket if we only think of data collection on people as the perfect random probability-based survey with 100% response rate. That's long out of the window, and we all know this. But we're still thriving towards it. And in recent discussion on data quality that we had in Germany in a workshop, and some of you participated in that, it was so clear. Even so, every time we try to say, it's like, let's put the research question first. Let's focus on that and see research question. All of our metrics and everything falls back to what we know about the perfect sample that then is a one size fits all and multiple stakeholders can use it kind of data set, right? And that has its limits, because sometimes, like in this situation here, if the main purpose of the data is to see where's the next wave of the COVID pandemic, and is country X and region C in country X at risk and needs more resources that WHO or someone else should push towards, then that is a signal that you can pick up, even if your frame was biased, if we know there is no relationship between what we are observing and the frame. And we all know this too, I mean, many of us taught these classes or sat in those classes where that was preached, but it isn't lived yet. And so, it's interesting for me to see more and more attempts of people trying to carry this notion forward, and I think that is future looking. Another challenge, though, is that increasingly we have more and more what I grew up learning called omnibus surveys, right? That we have these panel surveys, Knowledge Network, AmeriSpeak, now AmeriSpeak for Teens, the GESIS panel. In Germany, I feel like a lot of government agencies are also switching towards creating panels, because that feels like the more stable way to recruit people. So something that is carrying forward, but is a little bit at odds with what I just said, that you optimize for the purpose and the research question, right? So I think that is a challenge for us, how we square these two circles. And maybe it is okay. Maybe we have this one set that is sort of a high quality panel that is an all-purpose and can be done as that. And then for one-off studies, we're going the other direction. There's clearly a lot of need at these sort of benchmark surveys, and Pew is pushing in that direction, and others too, that we need one common core of data collection that allows everyone to use their favorite Mr. P version or whatever post-stratification adjustment you might be doing. And we'll come back to that point, because I do think there's hope in the future of maybe finding funding sources for that. And then, of course, 2 years ago, all of our heads started spinning, or at least mine, and maybe some of yours too, because in the advent of publicly visible AI tools and the transformer models, obviously the question came out immediately: how can we use this technology for us in surveys, right? And there were a lot of sort of low-hanging and obvious fruits, and my favorite one, but not all agencies have done that, and I would be curious to hear how SRO did this, is of course, take your old SAS code and move it into Python. It's a nice task for language models, because they're particularly good at coding. And so the number of tasks that can be helped and assisted with AI is larger than we have time this morning to talk about. But I want to highlight 3 that are all, if we had done a little survey with you guys here, obvious use cases that any one of you would come up or already came up with, right? So, but I want to bring us all on the same page, and if I can, create a little narrative across them that maybe is a source for the discussion afterwards. So if we look at the AI used for questionnaire design, it was interesting to me to see that the sort of research community compared to the market research community was rather slow in adapting that. You know, the market researchers jumped on this immediately. On the right, you see a whole bunch of YouTube videos where people tell you how to use AI to create questionnaires, right? And I mean, we know that the general public thinks asking questions is easy. We do this as children, you know, all day long, and so everyone thinks, and there's little appreciation on what it takes to do that. So you can ask, you know, systems like ChatGPT or your favorite language model, of course, to create a questionnaire for you, and that's what you see on the left-hand side. You know, the prompt here was create a questionnaire to evaluate a class, and then a set of questions was suggested by the language model, right? Now, I haven't spotted Stanley yet, but he said he would be here, or at least, there you are, okay. So, you know, if we sit down with Stanley, he would pick this apart, and if you ever sat with Stanley in a questionnaire design picking apart session, you better, you know, brace yourself, you know, because he will find something, right? He's an expert, but he doesn't scale well, so ideally we would like to have Stanley in everybody's living room or desk, sitting on everybody's desk. And it does now, right? Because you can ask these language models, improve these questions on his, and then you give the question that it's initially suggested. And then ask is like, what would Stanley do? You know, like, my husband, when he tries to speak German, he always says like, how would Arnold Schwarzenegger pronounce it? And then he just says the word in German accent. This kind of things, like how would Stanley do that, right? And he, and then, you know, we asked the model, like, okay, revise the question and explain why you did the revision you did. And here are two example answers. And you can see the revised question is much better. The explanation is pretty close to what Stanley Presser might have said, although I never checked that with you, Stanley. I maybe should do that. And it was interesting to me. Just last night, I got a message from Carolina Casas-Cordero. Some of you might remember her. She's a former student of JPSM, is now in Chile, and she was delighted to try this out with her students in Chile and then doing the whole thing in Spanish. So, you know, translating Stanley into a Spanish speaker who can do this kind of reasoning and improvement in Spanish is, of course, a fantastic tool that we would be foolish not to use. Now, being the researchers that we are, of course, you would want to see a little bit of research on how to do these prompts right and what's going on coming out of the APO community. And Trent Buscott and colleagues have presented something along those lines at the last APO meeting, and there's many more to come at this year's APO. I'm pretty sure about that. What this team here did is they created 4 different experiments in which they varied how the prompt would be done. They varied keywords given, whether you talk specifically about a survey, whether you ask specifically for response options. The complexity of the prompt was varied, the reading level of the items, and they controlled for the number of response options. All of the prompts, though, had this layer structure, you know, where first the task was described, and at the end the audience was described, and the intention. So there's a lot of information that you can give these models. And if you sort of scan the literature on using these language models in a larger way, you will see that context, context, context is the keyword to success here. And with, you know, a couple of additions explaining why you do things or encouraging the model to think through how they would answer this after having read Schumann and Presser, you know, would of course be even more context. Anyway, from that research that Trent and others did, it was clear that these ways of prompting have a huge effect, obviously, on the questions, right? And if you don't use survey, for example, you would get quiz-like questions rather than survey-like question. You know, you get it in a different format, not necessarily first person, but third person or open-ended answers, right? So paying attention on how you do that can be quite helpful to be successful in this space. For me, as I sort of keep browsing the ever-growing literature on how to use LLMs in that context, it is clear that it is helpful to point to good articles, to point to good textbooks. We can have a fist fight later on which ones are the best articles and textbooks, but given good prompting, it certainly can be a valuable help. And certainly when it comes to translation and the reading levels that I pointed out earlier. The resources are there, right? They're in this house, for what to give us context. And I heard some discussion earlier in the age in retirement breakout group, like how we create our own models maybe for even more context is certainly another thing that hopefully we can discuss at the end. So that's the first piece on, future of questionnaire design, that portion of data collection. The second piece, and I remember yesterday in the panel, with some smile in your face, okay, you said, oh, well, imagine, and now they're using the LLMs to create data, right? So this whole notion of synthetic data is one that came up in one paper that some of you might have seen, but this is really only one of many, many, many that use this technique. Not just out of one many in the title, but out of one researcher out of many that did this, this group around Lisa Argyle, who said, it's like, okay, well, instead of asking respondents, could we just create so-called persona, a description of demographics about a respondent, and then have the language model answer our survey questions accordingly. And I see Fred Conrad sitting there. This is not unlike what we saw 10 years ago when we tried to think about it. It's like, okay, how can we use social media and tweets and whatnot? Thinking is like, well, there is sort of a body of text that captured what the society is thinking, and let's extract knowledge out of it a little bit, right? I mean, it seems a little absurd to do this in the questionnaire format, and rightly so. You could argue, why not ask them for the aggregate statistic right away? Why go through the trouble of creating microdata for us? But be it as it may. How well that does work. So for the American National Election Survey, the group around BISBE did this and compared data that were created using these language models to the actual actual data from the American National Election Study. And what you see in these graphs are the feeling thermometers for towards the Democrats, Independents, and Republicans. This is a 1 to 100 scale, and you see it broken down in each row by different target groups. For each of these groups, though, the point estimate and the confidence or the uncertainty prediction that you would get creating the data in the synthetic way, we are ChatGPT 3.5, fell within the A and yes bands, right? And then you could was like, okay, all right, this might work, right? And of course, the interesting question is, when does it not work? And for anyone here in the room, I saw Raphael earlier, this could be a test question for you, but you know it, right? Because if we create synthetic data, we know getting the marginals right is often really easy. Getting the variance-covariance matrix right is much harder. And that's, of course, what they found here, too. If you now look at the relationship between these feeling thermometer answers and, intersectionality of demographic groups and what have you, then all of a sudden it falls apart and the predictions don't lie on the diagonal in each of these graphs, which is what we would expect if ANES and GPT results would line up, but they fall flat, which means the synthetic data are not a good prediction of what the actual data are, right? So the other little damper in this story was that, just like we saw with the first Xbox paper, and I mentioned Mr. P before, when Andrew Gelman suggested we could use this really non-probability colloquial way of using the word random collection of people that play Xbox to predict voting behavior, right? That only works particularly well in a US context and in the election context where you have a lot of information about people to get the prediction right with proper post-stratification. Same here. These predictions of election results, a team from Germany, Leah van der Heide, Alex Wenz, and Caro Hensch did this for a previous German election and now for the EU election, where most countries have multi-party systems, and a lot of recent change happened with the huge swing towards the right, it didn't work at all, right? So you see in these columns here the prediction in, I need to get the labeling right, but in green from the GPT models, and in orange from the German equivalent of the ANES, and we see that this does not work. You see also depicted here in the English translation how such a persona vignette would look like, right? It is a full description of the demographic variables and some other information that you might have in the survey, right? So these are all mimicking the answers of that particular survey, and then the question of what has been missing there, what would have the model set the respondent says to put in here. Now, filling in missing data with the model, or the model an interviewer might have in their head, is not entirely crazy, if you think about it. We are doing this, right? Brady is asking NSFG interviewers, does the respondent have kids or not? That kind of thing. I mean, it is also a language model in the head of the interviewer making a prediction. We know it's noisy, we know it's measurement error filled, but can be useful, More of a signal than no signal is what the research showed. And so I feel like before we poo-poo and dismiss it altogether, it is helpful to think of it as an imputation rather than creating a fake world. And imputation from a model that is more complex than we understand. It's utterly intransparent. It is not well trained for this task. But all these elements point to one thing: there is room for improvement, right? So they could get a lot better if we think of it that way. And I remember the first time I taught imputation in the stats department in Munich decades ago when I was there for a visiting stint. And some of these students that came straight, like mass stat students, and they was like, what, you just make up data? And I tried to say, well, we have a regression model and then in between, and we think this is how the world works. But it took real effort to convince them that this is a reasonable thing to even entertain thinking about, right? And it feels a little like that, right? Seems on the one hand completely crazy, but maybe an effort where it's worthwhile exploring how far we get. And in particular, because we have really a lot of opportunity to train these models well. So if you look at this paper by Kim and others that used the entire history of GSSE, the General Social Survey data, in order to train the models to create not just these personas, but to create embeddings, representations of particular survey items that had been asked over time and how they were answered, that create a period embedding, sort of learning what else was going on at that period of time, right? And then things like, okay, maybe then we get the prediction right, and maybe we can even retrodict, a survey item that wasn't asked in the past, but so it's like, what would have people said had we asked this item in the past? Completely new way of thinking about time series here, right? Again, not saying that we now know and have good theory on how this works reliably, and so that we can trust it. But it is certainly out there as an interesting piece of thought. And in this paper here, they looked at this possibility to predict, to retrodict, to impute. And, their conclusions are, of course, filled with caution, right? And more along the lines, well, maybe this is a good way to create an initial test data set to see what you want to study and how you do that. And it reminded me of something that we always teach in questionnaire design. If you create the questionnaire, generate some data, and then run your analysis model, and Brady's the first one to say, write the entire paper before you collect the data, so that you have everything in your research design, right? And it often broke down that, seemingly good advice, because the students not necessarily, or people we work with, are capable of creating multivariate data that reflect all the theories they have about the world. But here, with these persona prompts, that could be a vehicle that works pretty well. And even among, economists, no offense to those in the room, but they tend to be of the skeptical bunch. I heard Susan Essey talk at the event that Sienstedt gave about just that, that with her team, that's a way they sort of prepare for research projects. So in this sense, I do think, as crazy as I feel it is, and I'm unwilling to go along, I do think that this imputation notion could be a promising avenue. It needs evaluation, it needs comparison, and we have yet to find the right partnership to really understand how to use the model-embedded probabilities, and capture that, to see, it's like, okay, when is that prediction that the models give certain, and when it's uncertain, and what does that mean for augmenting data to maybe make it better in that particular prediction task? So same here, if we understand the missingness and the missing processes, maybe then we can improve the models. But what I've seen and found sort of amusing is that, at least among a set of computer scientists that suggest these models, they are reinventing what we would call matrix sampling, because that too is sort of the idea is like, okay, well, maybe not entirely the whole thing, but maybe not everyone needs to ask everything, and I can use the huge complex set of data to then augment what is missing. And that part is interesting because, I mean, if we are honest, we don't have good models how all the variables in our datasets relate to each other, and our largely linear model structure is sort of bound to fall short. What I found particularly interesting is the relationship of these language models in the data collection as it relates to interviewers, and whether they could or could not replace interviewers, but certainly whether they can or cannot replace the coding task that interviewers do. And this has been going on for a while. I know people here in this building worked on this using machine learning models to automatically classify code. The interactive nature that we see with the GPT-type system has been piloted way before these transformer models came up by several groups, and one of them is led by a former PhD student of mine, Malte Schierholz, who had back then thought, oh, couldn't we just have the machine learning models trained up so that they can be integrated into a CATI or CAPI interview, and the interviewer or the respondent typing in what their job description is, and then the model automatically classifying it into ISCO or your favorite classification system, and then spitting out the 5 most likely classifications, and then having the respondent be able to respond right away, that's it, or that's not, right? So that you have this, hyped up human in the loop way that we need to have to get good alignment of these language models built into the data collection process, right? When he tried it, it was a little slow. The interviewer had to wait. Obviously, typing is a bit of an issue. There's already a filtering going on. We all know that the interviewer might not type down everything the respondent said, but with the good voice recognition that we could include right now, there's no need to go through that filtering and then trying to expand it out, but you could go straight from the source and that qualitative text. And this is, I see it as a very exciting direction, all this qualitative text, in conjunction with sort of, traditional NLP techniques to extract information, to maybe extract new classification system. Phil Resnick at University of Maryland is mostly why I have this up here. He's pushing at this, connection of, the NLP world and the survey world quite a bit. Now, I thought it was interesting, right after these first models came out, we had a bachelor student in Munich who immediately turned this around. It was like, no, I don't want this thing to answer questions. I want it to ask questions. And then he coded up this little interviewer bot, right, that would administer survey questions. And then again, one of many groups that did this. But eventually, this led to some research that we just finished on seeing, well, could it work that we scale up these qualitative interviews that are so rich? Could we maybe leave those standardized questionnaires behind altogether? Because we know they were so difficult to draft, even if we have ChatGPT as a help and Stanley scaled up, right? Because, it's still difficult for the respondent to find themselves into the right answer category and what have you. Wouldn't it be nice if we could just get that information all the way? And so we did an experiment earlier this year where we randomly assigned pairs of students to, and one student is the interviewer, one interviewer is the chatbot task, and the third one observing. We trained them with the interviewing material that all of you developed. We fed them the questionnaires so that we can see how does that work, and what's the quality of the data, what's the rapport between interviewer and respondent. And this is a small N study. This is just to see, mostly to see the mechanics, can this even work? And it was interesting to see that in terms of relevance and clarity of this whole discussion and interaction, the two worked very comparably. They were rated as equally useful, both from the participant as well as the observers. The empathy, however, not surprisingly, in the AI interviews was rated as a lot lower, right? And this comes back to, I'm channeling Eleanor Singer here, and we know this already from the switch to web. Why bother giving these answers if it doesn't come with the benefit of talking to a human, in particular at times when maybe we don't talk enough to 3D people, right? And so I think that is interesting. And similarly, we saw engagement noticed lower. We saw, on the positive side, we saw the errors that the human interviewer did diverging from what we trained it to do as a qualitative interviewer or someone who does probing or a conversational type interview style, to not exceed the divergence that the human interviewers did, right? Both are not perfect, we know that, and both can be trained. And we could envision this training to be even better. So instead of just having one agent serve as an interviewer, you could train up two, one as a supervisor and one as an agent. And if the agent does the interviewing diverges, you can say, it's like, okay, well, maybe next time you do this. So basically mimicking what's happening in a phone center, right? And so I'm pretty confident that here too, there is a lot of room, to increase the quality of this type of data collection. But I do think that all the things that Fred Conrad and Mike Schober, in a workshop that took place a couple of floors upstairs in this building, a while ago had already discussed and pointed out, if this future ever comes true, which it sort of does now, right? How can we make these systems so that the people want to engage with them and that they adapt reasonably to respondents' thinking and feelings so that that engagement with the system is one that is actually fun, rewarding, and will lead to participation. So that problem won't go away, right? We're scaling up the technology. We might have a better way of measuring because we need to go through the standardization. But as we've seen with the big data wave, it just pushes the work to afterwards, or pushes the work to understanding these language models better and getting the transparency right and whatnot. So it pushes the work to more expensive people. And we've seen this in the push to using big data. For most large-scale data collection agencies that I know, it hasn't saved money to use the other data sources. It's just a different type of people we employ, right? And I see folks here nodding in the front. You don't see this in the back, but that seems to be, a narrative that you heard too. So is it worthwhile exploring that? I think absolutely, and there's also no choice. Everyone is expecting us to input, and it would be pretty silly not to. But there are clearly challenges. And some of the challenges were discussed at that workshop that came, that happened earlier this month. Was it last month? I'm getting the weeks mixed up here. September 25th, yeah. All the presentations and recording of the CNSTAT workshop that they organized on behalf of the NSF are available for those of you who want to see how across the disciplines, people think about the future of data collection. But one thing that I found interesting and sort of wonder what is our role here is how does a funding agency, or journal editors for that matter, deal with this future of data collection? I mean, we already have a situation where a lot of journal editors don't know all the keywords needed to evaluate studies and data collection as they're done currently, right? For those of you who are working in the medical field or in other fields, you might already have half of your gray hair just because you see so many articles say it's like, oh, this is a representative study, blah, blah, blah. And you know all they did is weight by age and gender, and it might not be a reliable source given how they recruited the people, right? We know the generalizability problem, even of well-meant studies, is an issue. But how do we go about this? If the data collection is augmented and help with these models, and this is true not just for the crazy imputation synthetic data part, but also for the automatic coding of the open-ended responses. They too suffer from context bias. They too have learned to understand words in a certain way. And so there too, we might push the interpretation, the coding, the results in whatever the model was trained with, direction, right? And so how can research in this space be evaluated as one that's sort of worth, funding, that's worth pursuing? If you have your internal rounds thinking was like, okay, is this something that we want to invest money in or not? These are difficult discussions, and I'm not sure if the people in the room are the right set of people to fully answer these questions, right? Because it is interesting right now. I'm at the Simons Institute for the Theory of Computing on a semester on large language models and transformers. They're the researchers still wondering how to get these models to do 2 + 2 correctly, right? And while they can do it, they're trying to understand when they might not be able to do it correctly, right? I mean, it's like they feel like we're still building this, And the other day when I told them what we on the social science side or other researchers are already doing full force using these models, they was like, whoa. Not intended that way. And it reminded me of this discussion around differential privacy, right? The researchers in the privacy researchers and cryptographers, they had this cool thing, this cool methodology, and we're a little afraid with sensors plowing ahead, applying these models, and well, we know how that story ended, it still creates a few challenges. Now, the pushing forward is great because it pushes the researchers to think about this theoretically in different ways, so to adjust what they do in research in a way that it is useful in practice. So I by no means want to stop anyone with the forcefulness going in that direction, but I think it is interesting to think through, it's like, okay, are there people, at the iSchool or in computer science that one can, entice for collaboration? And so one way of enticing that I feel like is right there, sitting there, is sort of the synergy of all these three, crystal balls that we're talking about. I think that we have seen, in the AI LLM world, many times people saying, we exceeded the improvement that we can make just by making the models better. The models will get better with better data, right? A lot of people are wondering how can, if these models read the internet, how can that be done more efficiently? Training these models costs a lot of compute time. And at the same time, we are sitting on this treasure trove of data that reflects society, both currently and in the past, right? And I do think that there is a possibility for, thinking through a next generation of training data that would create, would change these tools to be more useful for us, but also to be maybe better stewards of the answers that they give to anyone in the world who is asking these questions. And without a doubt, there are a lot of questions legally, ethically, that we need to consider when we think about that. But I wonder if this really has to happen on the microdata level. Maybe this can be one level up, aggregated maybe, using differential privacy or other techniques to lay on top, because the learning that happens doesn't have to be as precise, which is coming back to my first point, right? That I think we need to think strongly. It was like, okay, what is the level of precision that we need here that can be okay for us, but still makes these models a lot better? And so what I would hope, is that we get the UK Data Archive and ICPSR and ROPA and GESIS and you name them, archives of the world together, and so it's like, okay, well, could this joint set of hundreds of thousands, millions, if you think of them all, be used together in a way that, would improve these models, because I do think their use is large, and, and this could, of course, be a single fine-tuned model for our purposes, but what I'm thinking is really larger models so that an OpenAI or a Meta would put out models that are grounded in actual population data, and maybe they would pay for this. Maybe they can fund this one ground truth research study that's every year there to help align everybody else. We don't know, but that would be sort of a hope I have. And another hope I have is that we can continue this discussion at the next APOR. As representative of APOR, a little plug here for the conference. Gina Malenko, who is organizing the conference, is heavily trying to push us all to make room for thinking about the future of data collection. Thank you very much. And I believe we have a few minutes for questions.
Yes, we do. We have our regular microphone set up. Frauke is going to moderate, recognize people. We have some time for questions.
Please.
Yeah, I'd like to ask the
Just wait a second for the microphone.
I'd like to ask when you personify the LLM, would you mind talk about how do you do the prompt engineering? How do you access whether their response up to your expectation? How do you measure that?
So the architecture, how you do that, is usually done via an API, sort of an automatic protocol between you and the chatbot. Otherwise, you would need to do this 1,000 times by hand, which can also be done if you are willing to do that. But basically, what people do is they write out these little vignettes where they describe a person. I'm a 50-year-old woman living in Ann Arbor. In the past I've done this, and this is my income, and any demographic information that you feel is relevant, for example, to predict a voting intention, and then you, after that, formulate the survey question. So you're giving a context, you give it the information about the question and what the answer categories are, and then the system spits out the data, right? And this answer gets fed back into the data set as a missing piece. But you can automate this process. I mean, this can be done via the API pretty efficiently. The team around Leah van der Heide, they've done it within the Microsoft Azure environment, but you can set this up. I mean, I know that Michigan has 4 of these language models right there for anyone to use. The setup doesn't matter, but I would recommend using these API tools. It's surprisingly easy and surprisingly easy to do for people with non-technical skills, which in a way is great. I remember the early days when we wrote this textbook on using Stata. One of the book reviewers says, like, oh no, we don't like this. This is making statistics too easy. And so this democratizing of data, democratizing of access, is always a challenge for those who feel like they're in the know and do it right, But I do think that's certainly something that these models do. Yeah.
Hello, thank you for your talk. When I think about large language models, their performance and behavior evolves as the underlying corpus with which it is trained evolves, enriched, and is expanded over time. So I was wondering as to what your thoughts may be on implications for reproducibility of any scientific process that depends upon a large language model for which, like this phenomenon of the training data essentially evolves over time. Do we need to think about methodological advancements in this realm? What are your thoughts on implications for developing research protocols given this? Thank you.
Yeah, this is a great question. Thank you. It gives me the chance to go into my appendix slides, what I always teach PhD students to have. So this is from a paper that a colleague of mine in Munich, Reinhard Heckel, wrote with large set of collaborators. They try to sort of look more closely into what it takes to, train these models, what training data are there. And I found this graph on the data flow, the cleaning of the data flow, quite telling. So you're absolutely right. The large set of data initially used, whether this is an open model or not, is that already would be good to know. But what's even more important to know is what strategies were used to deduplicate the cases, when were records really deduplicated or not, because a certain amount of similarity you want to keep in order to get the weights right on what is more probable as an outcome and what is not. The many decisions on which quality of text would you allow, which subreddit on pornography you might not want to include, and all these decisions, right? It's a slew of decisions that's happening, right? So in addition, I would augment your question and say, it's like, in addition to the training data, we would want to have openness on these decision-making flows, on how the filtering, deduplication, and the like happens. There's no standard yet to do that. And I think you're right to point out that ideally we would have that, right? Ideally we would get insight into that. Maybe ideally we would be able to do our own. I'm waiting for the sampling statisticians to step up and it's like, we can train models just as good with fewer data because we know how to sample good data, right? I'm waiting for that to happen. But how you employ a sampling strategy to get stratification right on text rather than on numbers, I'm not clear. But that's, I think, an interesting conversation to have. And could be yet another interesting research strand. So I think your question is the right question. The field, neither ours nor computer science, has answers to that yet, because it's, all that worked so far is like throw everything at it, and then they're like, stepping back and it's like, whoa, now something happened that we don't even understand, right? So the level of not understanding what's going on, is gigantic, not just for me, and certainly challenged when I'm listening to these computer science talks, but also for them. It's just, there's a lot of unknown here what happened, because the size of these data sources is so large. Certainly one concern I think that is implicit in your question is not just, well, let me back up. On the reproducibility, I think that's what I meant earlier with the NSF guidelines and for reviewers, right? I mean, how do we even get to a place where we feel like we can reasonably know what was going on? If you work with open source models, you have the possibility to sort of freeze it, to take a model in a point in time, run these things on your own computer, make all your code public, and set seeds in a similar way that we know it from, anytime we create random variables in our favorite software packages. And then you can get to the same result, right? But so this would lead to a rejection of anything done in science with closed-ended models, because with closed models, because there you can't do it, right? That could be one approach for sort of the immediate fixing.
I'd like you to take us back to, I think, your first slide where you had your 3 boxes, which seemed perfect way of organizing things, but I'd also like to suggest add a 4th box in front of your questionnaire design. I'll call it study design. Wouldn't there be just a load of ways that AI could help design studies? And I'll push one further. In your role in APOR, APOR is, I think, uniquely situated to build a model based on all the APOR journals. And wouldn't that be helpful in what I'll call study design?
I have so many associations that come with your question, and unfortunately, the first one that came to mind was like, oh, I'm not sure if I would want to suggest future designs based on past designs, because the field is always evolving, right? I mean, we might read papers from 30 years ago and things like, oh, I would do this differently now. I mean, I have certainly written papers myself that I would not write that same way. So yeah, no, we certainly could do that. I think that would be a good hackathon type project for the conference, maybe something we should suggest to Gina. I might have been too fast when I said that these 3 points that I made here are really just one of many ways these language models could be used. Absolutely, ideation, design, creation. I mean, along the entire research pipeline, are there possibilities to use these models, right? And I mean, all the way down to how to, you have your rather dry for a journal-driven, paper, and now you wanted to turn it into a good social media post. I mean, the models are great at doing this, Summarizing is their core strength, So maybe before we do the study design for new stuff, we could already shrink down and synthesize all of the papers ever published in the APOR outlets and make that knowledge be more available to the general public. That would already be a good thing. And I'm looking at Mike here, not just to give him the mic for the closing words, but also because I know you care a lot about such kind of civil outreach. So yeah, thank you. That's a good point.
Is there one last question? Okay. Thank you very much, Frauke. It was a great presentation. Great job.
All right. Well, we are at the end of our program, and what an amazing day and a half this has been. Mike and I want to thank you all for participating in this very special event. We know it's a busy time for many of you, and we're so grateful that you took the time out of your schedules to join and be together as a community and really celebrate where ISR is going in the future. We also want to thank the ISR leadership for hosting and having this vision, especially Dr. Cagney, but all of the ISR leadership team has just been so wonderful and supportive. We want to thank the planning committee who spent the last 12 or 13 months, I've lost track, designing this program, especially Sandra Tang, Deirdre Gamiri, Maggie Fry, Lauren Guggenheim, Alexa Bell Talbot, Shauna Paulson. A big thank you to Catherine Pearson and Anna Massey and Tara Ingholm. So will you join me in giving them a round of applause? We also want to thank the ISR facilities staff for just making this a wonderful place, and it looks amazing, and it's gone off without a hitch, and we're so grateful for all the countless hours and all the after-hours work to make this just be as seamless and amazing as possible. And I'm going to now hand it over to Mike to give us a few closing words.
Well, we want to thank you all for coming, and for those of you who are online. I want to let you know that all of the sessions have been recorded and that we have copies of the slides of all of the presenters, so that we hope that the important intellectual elements of the symposium have been carefully recorded and will be available for you and for others into the future. Thanks again for coming and helping us to celebrate the 75th anniversary of ISR.